just changed the batteries and it worked the other day. Like it's acknowledging this, but like this isn't. I don't have them on. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm failing. I'm really, well, just in general, I feel like, okay. So I'm sorry.
Do you have an extra packet by chance? No, that's fine. I'll just stay with you next time.
You guys are so sweet. I'm so sorry. Like, I feel. One of those things. Sorry. Okay, so let's talk evolution. We're going to talk about how the theory of evolution developed, and then we'll get into, I'm sure you know this guy's name, Darwin, and how, we'll talk about some controversy, interesting controversy about Darwin and his life. Okay, so ideas about evolution, they've been around. I mean, I would hypothesize that even like 8 million years ago, like Sahelanthropus, one of the first humans, probably they were talking about like, how did we get here? So people have always been kind of speculating, how did life start? So even back to, you know, like the ideas of the philosophers, a lot of philosophers, when they were sitting around pontificating and looking at the world and trying to figure out the big whys of the world, they were talking about evolution. And so this guy, Anaximander, he was a Greek philosopher, he believed, and this is true today, that life arose in water, which based on the timing of the creation of the earth, when a bunch of meteorites crashed together and started rotating around our sun, the majority of the earth was covered in water, so this is likely to be supported, and that life started out as simple forms and eventually became more complex, which is what we do have evidence for today. So sometimes these philosophers got it right, and sometimes they did not. And that's why we have science, right? People come up with ideas, and then you test to see if you can produce support for those ideas. That's where science comes in. Aristotle, he had a lot of great ideas, but then he came up with fixed species. And what Aristotle believed was that organisms were put on the earth in a form and they never, ever changed from that form. And we know that's not true. He also created this ladder of perfection. Guess who he put at the top of the ladder? Us. I'm not sure we're so perfect, right? Especially everything that's going on today. You know, just like, so, and then he categorized the most perfect organisms. And look at, like, plants are down here. To me, like, plants should be, you know, if we could make our own ladders of perfection, we're the best, but we can't live without anything else, especially plants, you know. So plants, higher plants, lower plants, and just like rocks. So we know this isn't true, and this is very debatable. George S. Buffon in the mid-1700s started collecting fossils. He found bones, imprints, and figured out that from collecting bones and imprints and fossils, that species were changing over time. That he had, you could take a look at, and this is like another thing in terms of evolution, that oftentimes with evolution we might think things start small and then they get bigger over time. But like the dinosaur era and into when the mammals came about, there were, like dinosaur era, there were things like the Glyptodon that were huge. This is like the size of a car. And we see a lot of similarities in the current day armadillo, which is much smaller. We've also seen over time whales go from big to small to big to small. It all depends on what characteristics the environment favors at the given time. That allows you to survive better. So just think simple to complex. That is the main idea in terms of organisms. And even simple could be big, or it could be small. So don't think big to small, or yeah, big to small. Think simple to complex. Lyell studied fossils also and suggested, this was like, whoa. A lot of people thought the Earth was like 2,000 or less years old, that it was really, really young. And Lyell started looking at fossils and was like, I think it would take a really long time for something like a Glyptodont the size of the car to eventually evolve into something that's much smaller. So maybe that took like 6,000 years. And people were like, oh, no, the Earth is not that old. Well, now, I mean, this is like almost laughable, or it is laughable, because we know the Earth is like 4 billion years old. So sometimes the scientists put forth things that they were like shunned by society for saying their ideas based on their data. We still know that to be true today, right? People say things and you could be like, no, even though they're giving you evidence, and we're susceptible to just believing things without looking at evidence, and that was true even way back in the 1800s. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had some good ideas, and one that he proposed was the idea of adaptation, which is huge. Adaptation says that organisms who have characteristics that do well in an environment live successfully in that environment. That's adaptation. And if you don't have good characteristics for the environment, you are not well adapted. The idea of adaptation is based in genetics, it's based in reproduction, survival, depending on the characteristics that you have given the environment today. So, like, for example, if we're looking at, let's say that the Earth, we just suddenly have these huge floods, and we're back to the Earth as the majority is covered in water. As humans, are we well adapted to living 100% time in water? No. Do you think humans are going to do well if we have these mass floods? No, even given our technology, there's only so many boats that we can float in, right? So we're not well adapted. If the environment changes, nature selects for those who have the good genes right now, and those who have the good genes right now survive in that environment. Here's the other thing, is that evolution, the idea here is that reproduction comes into play if you have good genes. So if we're in an environment, and I always like to say, let's say that, all of us, we have these days where, we're running. So you get up in the morning, you're like, oh my gosh, I gotta leave right now, otherwise I'm gonna be late for class, and I have an exam and I can't be late. And so you run to class, you don't have anything for breakfast, and then after that class you have another class, and then you have to go to work. And so you're just gotta, like your day is stacked. You don't have time to stop for food. And you go to work, and then 11 o'clock you're home and you haven't eaten yet today. When you get home from work, what is the first thing on your mind? Okay, right, food. Are you thinking, you get home from work and you're like, I wanna have sex? Does your brain allow you to go there when you are starving? No, your brain is like, I'm focused on survival, which means I haven't eaten all day. I'm gonna focus on getting food. And then once you have your food and you're comfortable, then you might be like, oh, I'm surviving, I'm cool, everything's great. Then you might start thinking about sex. So back to my example of if the world suddenly is full of water and we're all swimming, and we're trying to find boats and we're competing with others to get on those boats. When you're swimming, are you thinking, wait, time out, I'm gonna find somebody to have sex with? No, you do not have time. You are focused on survival. So in terms of evolution, this is the idea of natural selection and adaptation. If the environment changes, boom, changes to something totally different, do you just happen to have genes that make you adapted to that current environment? If you do have the genes that make you adapted, it means you survive easy. You have time to have sex because you're living cool, right? You're living life easy, so you have time for sex. And then what happens is you pass on your advantageous genes to a next generation and to a next generation. And so that's how evolution happens, is that when the environment changes, things can switch really quickly from perhaps like the mammals, when the dinosaurs were around, the dinosaurs were huge and the mammals were little. The mammals just stayed out of the way of the dinosaurs, and they lived up in trees and they were active at night. When the dinosaurs went away, suddenly they were like, hey, we can be active during the day. We can come out of the trees. We have this whole environment to ourselves. We're not gonna get picked off like little snacks by the dinosaurs. So because that meteorite crashed and the dinosaurs die off, now suddenly the mammals are adapted better. So that's evolution. It's just all by chance events, but it's based in your genetics. And if you are adapted to the environmental change, you have time to pass on your advantageous genes. So Lamarck had that great idea, and then he went a little off the rails, and he had this idea of inheritance. We know it means genetics, of acquired characteristics. This term acquired means that he thought you could get your characteristics from somewhere other than your genes. I don't think he really thought that, but I think he just like it wasn't called this initially, but he just thought that. So let's say, like me, got a few piercings in my ears. According to the inheritance of acquired characteristics, I would have children who would have the same ear piercings. When they're born, they would have my ear piercings. Is that possible? No, right? Like I acquired them after I was born. They are not based in my genetics. So this was kind of ridiculous, right? You dye your hair purple, and then you believe your biological children will also have purple hair. No. Okay, so that was a little bit cuckoo. We know evolution is based in genetics, and that's what this did not include. All right, so here it just gives you kind of like over time, at least what we know written down. Like I said, I bet like millions of years ago, the humans were kind of talking about how did we get here, and why are these changes happening? But at least what we have documented, we have from about the 1700s on, and still things are changing today, right? We're sequencing whole human genomes to see, and then once we have whole genomes of organisms, and once we have the whole genomes of organisms, you can compare pieces of like proteins and see how close are they. So we're still working on this today. All right, here's Charles Darwin. Old Chuck. In the early 1800s he was born. By 1831 he was a young man. His dad was a doctor, and his dad was like, Charles, you're very smart. You will be a doctor too. Here's the problem. Charles would go in and be around like a surgery, and he'd pass out from the sight of blood. He's like, not my thing. I don't want to be around living. I can't cut into him. The blood makes me sick. And so eventually his dad was like, well, I guess you can't be a doctor if you pass out every time something gross happens, right? So Charles became a naturalist. And what this means is he just like observed the world around him. He took a lot of drawings. We might call him an ecologist today. And there's a lot of like really messed up things even going on in the early 1800s in terms of humans and society. Back in England, where he was from, it was very classist. There was a lot of white people there. And so then they were like, well, we have to make a structure of who's better than each other, because that's the way humans do it. And they were like, well, if you have money, you're better than everybody else, which some of that nonsense still holds true today, which we know is not true. And Charles' family was wealthy, and so he was in that upper class. And they also believed that captains of those big explorations where they went around the world, they also were in the higher class, the captains, but the crew was in a lower class. And so the captains would not speak with their crew. So they would be on these like 2-year voyages, and they wouldn't speak to their crew because they felt they were better than them. Is that stupid or what? I mean, stupid. So the captains would literally go insane, because we know that in isolation, humans, we do not thrive. We need other people to thrive. And so then eventually they were like, well, maybe we could put some of these naturalists on board, these ecologists, and then they would be my companion. And so that's how Charles got on one of these cruises. And what he found, and this is also like kind of wild, right? Because the first time somebody went out, they didn't know the Earth was round. And they were like, let's go see if we fall off or if we come back. And so these voyages, they didn't know what to expect. And so the voyage on the HMS Beagle went down, hit South America, goes around, comes back up. A lot of famous things that we know about Darwin. His data occurs in the Galapagos, go around past Australia, through the Cape of Hope of Africa. They made another stop back at South America, and then back home. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that he figured out. So Darwin, everywhere he went, he was like collecting specimens, he was digging in the dirt, he was drawing. And one of the main things that he noticed was that everywhere he went looked similar to England, but everything was just different enough to match the weather and the climate of the place that he visited. So for example, there's these like kind of bigger rabbits, they're called hares, that live in England, and they're bigger, they're a little bit chubbier, it's a little bit colder climate there in England. So bigger, have a lot more fat, have really thick fur, and have really short ears. And all of those are adapted to living, all of those characteristics are adapted to living in a cold climate, right? The fat and the fur keep you warm. The little ears don't allow for the radiation of heat off the body, keeps the heat close to the body. When something has long ears, it's like a heat radiator, allows heat to go off the body and cool the body. So he was like, well, we have those. And then he went to South America and he saw bunnies that had real short hair, were real skinny, had really long ears, which matched warmer environments. And everywhere he went, he compared species and he was like, they all look similar, but they match the weather and the climate, huh? So he knew there had to be something, some kind of adaptation of a species to be best suited to surviving in the environment that they live in. So he started that idea of natural selection brewing based on knowing a little bit about adaptation originally. Buffon and Lyell got confirmed that, yeah, the Earth was probably a lot older than it was. He used fossil ideas just like they did. His job was just pick up fossils everywhere he went. Museums today from these voyages still include fossil matter that was collected way back in the 1800s. So the Galapagos Islands, while things happened, like I mentioned with the hare and the bunny, Darwin has tons and tons and tons of support for the idea of natural selection, adaptation, genetics. Galapagos has some famous ideas about the birds. The Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America, right at the equator, very warm, very dynamic environment. There were a few things that he saw. So the lesser known ones was that he compared green iguanas to marine iguanas. And when we say green, the green iguanas live on land. The marine, when you hear marine, it means ocean, that they're more living in the ocean. So just to give you an idea of what they look like in action. Okay, so this is a green iguana. They're vegetarians.
Dinosaurs have been extinct for 65 million years. They're not, in fact, direct descendants.
I want to give you an idea of a really small head.
Some scientists now believe that the social...
Oh.
The dinosaurs...
Big claws. See the big hands for climbing trees? They have big claws. They're really skinny because they have want to lift themselves up trees.
The babies form peer groups, unexpected behavior for primitive reptiles.
Those are frogs, those aren't, I was like, oh, no, they are iguanas, oh my
They
gosh.
taste each other,
The baby
forging
iguanas.
social bonds that may help them survive a risky start.
But you can see they're bright green, they're good climbers, blend in with vegetation, so when they climb a tree, they can blend in with the leaves or in a bush, but they're mostly eating fruits and vegetables and plant matter. Right, the marine iguanas. The marine iguana, you can see the head is much bigger. Marine iguanas, they feed mostly off of algae in the ocean. Now, any of you this morning have your favorite breakfast of salt water? No, we don't drink salt water, right? It doesn't taste good. We know that because it's like we can have too much sodium in our body, and that's really bad for us. It dehydrates us. So they have to have strategies that deal with trying to get the algae, but also getting mouthfuls of salt water at the same time. So their head is really huge because it's got tons of mucus glands in it. They have really big nostrils, small nostril, much bigger nostril. And then you can see the bumps on their heads, and they use that to scrape algae off the rocks. So they'll scrape the algae, and then they'll take bites of it. And they certainly can kind of like spit out some of the salt water, but what happens is that when they have the algae in their mouth with the salt water, they release mucus also, and the mucus grabs onto the salt. And then the mucus, when they get back on land, they snot it out. So very different than your green iguana. This is what they look like when they're snotting out that salt. It's pretty much what they do all day long is snot. But look how big their heads are. Much bigger than the green iguana. Yeah, pretty crazy. So that was one example that we don't hear as much about, but that Darwin had learned about from making observations. Not just animals, he learned about plants, fungi, anything he could see. He saw, things are different from island to island even in the Galapagos. And then also he made comparisons between the islands to the larger land masses. So most famous about Darwin are his finches. And finches are a small type of bird. I believe there's like 400 different species or more of finches. And there are a lot of different kinds of finches on the Galapagos Islands, but there were also finches that lived on the mainland of South America. And he noticed that between each island and South America, there were very distinct differences in the characteristics of the different kinds of finches. And that the finches were, the way that they looked matched, for example, the food source available on the island in which they lived. And this is kind of the most famous kind of like what people talk about all the time in the books about Darwin, are these like observations he made that showed that each island's finches were adapted or well suited to living on that particular island based on what was available for them to eat, live, do their jobs, predators, prey, etc. So, for example, we've got 4 different kinds of finches. One of the things that he looked at was their beaks and the way their beaks were formed. So that, like, this one that's eating a lot of plant matter, it had these like serrations, kind of like teeth-like, but on the edge of the beak, which allowed to cut or rip leaves, which were really tough. And so they could like chisel like we could with teeth. And their beak was very big and sturdy. Ones that ate little tiny insects had long pointy beaks to grab at those little tiny insects. Ones that were eating seeds had really big, thick beaks because the seeds were hard, so they needed a lot of strength in that beak. And then ones that were eating cactuses could pick around the spines, so they also had like a very long, tough beak to get in between the spines. But he also noticed, like I said, that these finches that lived out on the islands of the Galapagos had a very good resemblance in their body size, the composition of their beak, their feathers, their coloring, to finches that lived on the mainland of South America. And he was like, this can't be just by chance that they all look alike. There's got to be some relationship here. There's got to be something going on with the environment that they all live in and them being well suited or adapted. So they've got to have some kind of like genetic basis that's similar. So Darwin came back from his voyage. And he was like, hey, world, guess what? Guess what? I figured out evolution. There's this thing called natural selection, and he went on about adaptation and changes based on the different environments, and everybody was like, dude, you're crazy. And society shunned him. He was like the pariah. And so he was like, well, if you all can't appreciate what I'm doing, I'm just gonna go into my lab. I'm gonna like start to catalog all this stuff, and I'm gonna still draw a lot and categorize, and I'll just, you know, like do my own thing since y'all are me. But then, in 1844, this guy, Alfred Wallace, sent out a paper. Alfred also did some explorations, and Darwin was like, this guy has the same ideas I had. But now, like 15 years later, people were like, oh, that's cool. Interesting. Alfred Wallace, you're a genius. And Darwin was like, what? I said that. So Darwin was like, all right, I'm gonna like pair up with Alfred Wallace. And they went to a conference, 16 years later, and they were like presented their ideas together. So Darwin was vindicated by Alfred Wallace's also thinking about it. The other thing that's great is like when you have a really big idea and you come up with this independently, and then somebody else who you admire, respect, comes up with a very similar thing, it supports you, and you're like, yes, I'm not alone, I am supported here. So Darwin was really excited. So this is where things really started to roll, was after this conference that they presented together. So just some ideas that they both came up with independently, which is like, you know, kind of cool because somebody else saw the same thing, similar things you did, and came up with similar conclusions. Right? Doesn't it feel good? You're in lab and your lab partners, you're like, you got an idea about what was going on, and you're like, your lab partner says the thing that you're thinking, and you're like, yeah, we got it. That feels good. So they both came up with independent ideas, but they were similar. They had very similar shared experiences in exploration, cataloging, drawing. They traveled a lot. They saw species might be similar and vary in a few different traits depending on the environment that they lived in. They could see that abiotic factors, the environment, would have an influence on who survived better in different environments. That would also affect how far they could go, how they were distributed geographically. The biggest conclusion, so we're in the mid-1800s, species do change over time. And for whatever reason, probably because the philosophers were doing their philosophizing, and people were talking about more and more about the idea of evolution, natural selection, in kind of more vaguer terms, and more scientists were studying that society was ready for these big ideas. So that's the thing, it's like sometimes you might have an idea and people are like, oh, that's radical, but you find the people who can support you, and the group grows larger and larger, and then things change. So this idea of natural selection, nature selects for those who are best adapted. sometimes, especially in like evolution, a lot of these terms, if you just think about the words, they make sense. So, as I've been saying, advantageous genes make you adaptive. If you're cool as a cucumber, where you're living, you have an easy time surviving, so then you have time to have sex and pass on those advantageous genes to offspring. Individuals who are just struggling to survive, they're struggling for a place to live, they're struggling to get out of the weather, they're struggling to find food. Their focus is on survival and not having sex. So if you are not adapted, you do not have advantageous genes, you are likely not going to have offspring. Right? Easy survivors can have offspring. Those that are having a hard time surviving, they don't have time for that. They're just surviving. So that's why over time you see changes based on climate change, right? I said that climate change has always been happening. The climate has always been changing. Things have always been happening naturally. So who is or has advantageous genes or well adapted can change really quickly. And so that over long periods of time, if the environment changes, you can see different groups being favored. Okay, this happens, oh, now a different group is favored. So their population numbers go up. But the environment changes, then their population numbers may go down. The traits that are favored go up and down. Traits that are favored can wildly change depending on what environmentally changes. We call this also descent with modification, passing on, but things modify, they change given the environment. All right, so we talked about the finches, right? Let's think about this question. The existence of species of flightless birds with wings suggests what? Like penguins don't fly, they swim, but they have wings. Ostriches have wings, but they don't fly. What does this suggest? Does it suggest A, they're not related to birds, to flying birds? Does it suggest that? No, right? They both have wings. There's something going on there, right? There's some relationship. They are descended from flying birds, but have adapted to their particular environment. That sounds pretty good. Let's hold on to that. They are more related to bats than flying birds. Their bats have real skinny wings. Bats have real like these like filaments between their bones and their wings. Bats are more active at night. They are closely related to fish, but are evolved to becoming flying birds. That sounds weird, right? But they were created in a lab. No. Okay, so good. So make sure, even if B sounds good, just read through the other ones and be like, no. Just in case. All right, so Darwin and Wallace, their theory of evolution rests on 3 principles of nature that led to the big idea of natural selection. So let's talk about these. Principle 1, traits are passed on from parent to offspring. Genetics, right? We know that sperm carries 23 genes for humans, egg carry 23 chromosomes for humans, egg 23 chromosomes for humans. We know that we get our genes from our parent individuals. So definitely, this is evolution is based in DNA and genetics for sure. So inheritance is not acquired, it is concrete in your cells. So remember, when you see that inheritance of acquired characteristic, acquired means you get them from somewhere outside of yourself. That doesn't happen. All right, principle number 2. More offspring are produced than are able to survive, so sources for survival and reproduction are often limited. And they can be, and sometimes, I mean, it depends on like where that population is at the time, how many resources are available, So, the other thing is like not everybody survives is this idea. And that goes with what do you have? What genes do you have that allow you to survive? If you're a good survivor, you have a better chance of having offspring. But even so, it doesn't mean all your offspring will have the exact same genetics as you, because we don't have the exact same genes as our parents. Ours are modified a little bit through different processes. So even though I have advantageous genes, it doesn't mean all of my offspring will survive. Maybe, likely, but not 100% guaranteed. All right, survival and reproduction are not determined by chance. A lot of evolution is determined by chance. But when we're talking about survival and reproduction, this is based on, right now, the environment changes, boop, boop, boop. Do I have the advantageous genes? I already have the genes in me. I can't change my genes based on the change in the environment. I just go with what I have. So again, you have what you have in terms of your genetics, and if it matches up, then you survive easily. You have time to reproduce and pass on those genes to the next generation. Okay. Next part of principle number 3 is offspring vary, right? We don't all look exactly like our parents, and offspring, meaning like your brothers and sisters, don't look exactly like you either. So there are variants in every organism, regardless of you're coming from perhaps the same mating pair. The offspring are different as well. Differences in genetics is key to a population's survival, because if the environment changes and we're all exactly the same, so like for example, the water example, Earth becomes covered in water, just us, right? So one, if you're a better swimmer, do you have a better chance of surviving than someone who's never swam before? Right, so you might just like, depending on your genetics, right? If somebody is just like naturally better made for swimming, they're going to have a better chance of survival because we have variance in our genetics. When the environment changes, we hope that as a population, we have enough variance in our population that somebody's going to survive, that will keep the humans going. That's the idea of kind of going back to population genetics. When things change, if there's a variant in facing environmental resistance, we hope they can survive. They might go at a lower carrying capacity, but they'll survive and keep our population going. So, for example, like humans, right, we all look totally different. Even if we look at, maybe you collected some of these or you went somewhere and you saw these in a shop and you're like, they're pretty. If you look closely at these kinds of snails with the swirls in them, what you can notice is that if you put a bunch of them together, even if you took all the ones that are more yellow, you will notice that, like looking at, for example, this one, who's got a really wide spiral of colors, and this one is way more narrow, and this one's even more narrow. And the band colors, like look at this, there's no black here, but this one has a lot more black to it. That even individuals who look similar, there are specific differences. All right, so let's get into this idea of evolution as a theory. What is evolution? Evolution is a theory. A theory states that there's this theory, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so modern organisms have come from modified, or descended and modified based on their abilities to survive in the current environment. We come from a parent organism or a pre-existing form of that species. A change in the proportion of individuals in a population is based in what's going on with the environment right now, who has the most advantageous genes or is best adapted will survive and pass on those genes. We might see changes in the physical way the population looks over time based on changes in the environment and which variants are best adapted or survive better. Okay, so here we go. What's a theory? I'm gonna see I put it in quotes, fact. We might call it a fact. And according to science, there are no facts. That we have things that are proved or disproved, which sounds more like facty fact, right? We often will say supported or not supported. As close to a fact given the current time and the current technology that we have. Things change over time. Ideas change over time based on people doing research and giving new evidence that might say that's mostly true, but actually it's like this. So we do change science over time. Theories are based on a lot of scientists who have a lot of data to support the same idea. So if I said, if I like look out the window right now and I'm like, because it rained today, it's gonna be a really rainy fall. That's a theory. Is that true? No, right? Because I'm just like hypothesizing something. So a lot of times when we in our society talk about a hypothesis, when we say a theory, we mean hypothesis, right? I hear it all the time in the lingo. Someone will say, I have a theory that this fall is going to be wetter. And it's like, no, that's your hypothesis about it. The whole scientific community did not get behind you and say, you have evidence to show this. So we often use those terms wrong. There's a lot of evidence to say that living things are based in genetics, that based on your genetics, given the current environment, if you have advantageous or adapted genes or traits, you have an easier time surviving and passing on those advantageous or adapted genes to your offspring. So we're going to take a look at all of these different categories of support for this big idea of evolution and natural selection. This is what our lab's going to be about today. So you're going to get to see the physical evidence. It's pretty cool in lab. All right, so what is fossils? Fossils are rocks that can be dated, but fossils come from, these particular kind of rocks, come from the remnants of living things. Can you go back a little bit? Fossils can be dated. We have a bunch of different ways that we can take cells from those fossils and we can say how old they are, which is kind of cool. Fossils can show a progression through time. So that's why like the idea of the glyptodont and the armadillo, they found so many characteristics similar. And then if we can extract from cells within fossils, if we can extract DNA, sometimes in fossils we can like run their genome too. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so fossils are not only the bones. All the time, like if you have a dinosaur book from when you were a kid, a current dinosaur book, do you think there's going to be some changes? Yeah, because people have discovered more fossils and they've made corrections to that dinosaur book that you had as a kid. So we do see changes based on evidence that people are collecting over time. When we're talking about fossils, we're not just talking about the bones. We're also talking about like imprints or other things that we find around those bones. And so, like for example, you might find near a leg, you might find a footprint. If you've ever gone to the Field Museum, you can like sit in one of the dinosaur footprints, right? It's kind of cool and see how big their feet are. So that's a fossil too. Around the bones, they might find impressions that are bumpy and conclude, oh, that must have been the texture of their skin. There might be like feces. And what they can do with the feces, just like you did with the owl pellet, they can look and see what did they eat. They can dissect this and get an idea of what kind of food was it eating. And then they might find eggs, and they might get an idea of, did they have live births? Maybe they find like inside of this area, maybe they find a small fossil of a smaller version of this and say, oh, it must have had live birth, or maybe nearby they found eggs. So then we can tell a little bit about how they reproduced. So they put all this stuff together. It's also why, like, maybe this dinosaur here, maybe in your book, it's that color, but in my book, it's more brown. We're taking a guess on the colors too.
But since like the dinosaurs are already extinct, wouldn't these things decay over time?
Wait, say the second part?
Since they're like extinct, wouldn't the feces and the eggs decay over time?
They like, sometimes. It all depends on the environment. So sometimes these might be in like a really low acidic environment or high acidic environment, it depends, and it might like keep them intact. So it just depends on, you'd think like all of this would just go away, but it's amazing that it didn't. Yeah, so it depends on environmentally what might support it not decaying. Yeah, good question. And then the other thing that we can figure out in terms of fossils is that depending on the fossil layer, I mean, one maybe more obvious but not always completely true is the deeper something is, the older it is. But you also have to look at like layers, because in different areas this may be compacted to not be very deep. So, but you have to acknowledge that these layers mean different eras of life over time. So they kind of put those things together too. And we don't just have dinosaur fossils, we've got even plant fossils. We've got very, very ancient organisms who lived at the beginning of the evolution of animals when they were underwater. So we've got all kinds of details. We're going to look at comparative anatomy. Evolution happens gradually, meaning really, really, really slowly. It's not fast. This idea of gradual evolution depends on the length of reproduction time between parents and offspring, or when the offspring are able to reproduce. So for bacteria, evolution time can be really, really quick because from the parents to the offspring, they're passing over within maybe 20 minutes. They're giving on their DNA. The big thing here is to give us variance in a population is that when a parent makes their sperm or egg or copies their entire genome asexually to hand it over to an offspring, that mistakes can be made in copying that DNA. And that's just by chance. So, for example, if I told you all, I want you to take your textbook, the online textbook, it's like 800 pages. I would like you to copy it by Thursday and hand it in. I'm gonna grade you on mistakes. Do you think you're gonna make a ton of mistakes just trying to copy 800 pages by Thursday? Right. So that's kind of like what happens when parents make their DNA to pass into sperm or egg or asexually copy their DNA. Is that they're trying to do it really, really quick. There are some checkpoints that kind of like look and see and correct mistakes, but even the checkpoints can't catch everything. So that's where we get variation. Variation, I think oftentimes when we think about those mistakes, which we call mutations, we're like, oh, mutations are bad, right? Mutations lead to diseases, but also mutations lead to like the differences in eye color. Is there a huge advantage in general? There's a little bit of advantage to having darker eyes because you have more melanin. More melanin protects your eyes from the sun better. But other than that, like, do you get superpowers if you have green eyes? No, right? Like, I mean, you know, hair color. Is there a big advantage to having a different hair color over another? Not really, right? So we get these variations that pop up that could be like, okay, it just gives us another version of what we have in that particular gene. Could be something that gives you a little bit of an advantage, like brown eyes, you get a little bit of advantage of having that extra sun protection. Or darker skin gives you more sun protection. So there we can see, oh, here's a variant that comes up in humans. It gives us a little bit of a better variation. And then we, so don't get stuck on in terms of this unit. When we say mutation, all we mean is a change in the copying of DNA. Those copies can be bad. They can be like not bad or good, and then they can be good. So we have these variations. Regardless, it takes time to see huge changes in the variations in a population and what's favored. So we're going to take a look at different skulls. You'll look at all of the different primate skulls, of which humans are included. So we're going to look at humans, we're going to look at the great apes. What we're going to see is when we take a look at the groups of the great apes, all the way to the groups of the different humans, what we see in the great apes is that their teeth are much bigger. Teeth are much smaller in humans. Look at the jaw size. Our jaw is much smaller. They're trying to, some of the great apes are predators, that they have to actually like rip and tear, or they have to defend themselves, and they can use that big strong jaw to defend themselves. Over time, humans, like look at us now, we can drive up and get food, right? We need a big, like when you go into Jewel, you're in the produce section going, right? No, we don't need to do that anymore. Our face gets flatter. They have more of a snout. We have a flat face. Again, that jaw is important for protection and feeding. Us, not so much. This, you can probably feel a little bit of a ridge where your eyebrows are, just a little bit. When we look at humans, we have a little one. When we look at some of the great apes, like the gorillas, they have a much bigger one. Protects the eyes. Again, you're not like biting at your food, so you don't need that big eye protection. Brain. All right, here's one thing where it kind of reverses, that we saw the great apes were having bigger features, but here, in comparison, this is a human brain. This is the human. A gorilla has a much smaller brain than we have. Does it make us smarter? In terms of the skull, our brain, look at the real estate our brain takes up. Our face is very small. Look at the real estate. Now look at the gorilla. Look at the real estate that the jaw takes up, and the brain is much smaller. Limbs. We're going to look at the forelimbs of vertebrates, organisms that have a backbone. Oh, sorry, did you mean? No. Okay, more related organisms share similar characteristics. We're going to specifically focus on the forelimbs, the front limbs, like our arms, or like the dog's front legs of vertebrates, those that have a backbone. We have what are called homologous structures. You might have heard this term homologous before. H-O-M-O means same. Homologous chromosomes, right? Similar. When we have homologous structures, it means that these structures have similarities to one another. There's a closer evolutionary relationship, which means that these who share similar characteristics evolved from a common ancestor. Common ancestor means that, like the great apes, that we will see the great apes and the humans have a common ancestor. We did not evolve from them, they did not evolve from us. There was like this hybrid thing, and then we have us, both groups come off. So the forelimb, the front limb, arms, wings, front legs, right? Call it a front leg. Your cat and dog, you don't call them their arms, you call them their legs, right? Their front legs. In all of the vertebrates have a humerus, a radius and ulna, carpals are the wrist, metacarpals are the hand, and phalanges are the fingers. We all have those within our four limbs. Not four limbs, F-O-R-E limbs. Four meaning front limbs. All the bones are made of a very similar material. They're calcium carbonate based. But, like for example, birds and bats, their forelimbs, the bones have a lot of big holes in them to make them lighter so they can fly, so that their bones are not as heavy as us, right? You could be as strong as you want, and you could flap your front arms as much as you want. Are you gonna lift off the ground? No, we're too heavy, we're too bulky. Whereas birds, all they gotta do is go like, right, and they're up. Base composition is the same, but the way that it's executed is very different, depending on their needs, what is favored in that group. We call this divergent evolution, when you have a common ancestor, but your traits become different over time. So we're moving away from the base common ancestor to be better suited to our own environment. So here's a bunch of different kinds of vertebrates. If we just look at kind of like the function of the phalanges, the fingers. So our fingers and like a shrew, we manipulate things, right? We have ones that are better for running. A sheep, they're pounding. Their phalanges are actually fused into hoofs because they're, and you can see the dog ones are more like this. They're more flat. Swimming, kind of like the grasping, but encapsulated in a fin. They have very similar hand features, but it's all into like one fin. And then you have the flying ones where the phalanges are very long and skinny, and again, different composition within the bones. Vestigial structures, or you might call it vestigial. These don't serve any current purpose. Based upon the current environment, they don't serve any purpose. But they do connect us to a common ancestor. So they show some evolutionary evidence, but we don't really need them given the current environment. So like us, how many people do not have any wisdom teeth? Ooh, you're like really evolved. That's like high evolution, nice. So high evolution means in terms of wisdom teeth, is that our wisdom teeth, we have an extra set of molars, some of us, and what happens is when they start coming in, we don't have room in our jaw space for them. And so when they start coming in, what they can do is push all your other teeth forward and mess up your bite. Can also cause like overlapping areas, a lot more overlapping areas, which can cause more bacteria to get in between your teeth. And teeth bacteria are linked to heart disease. Yeah. So, if you don't have those molars, you don't worry about your jaw getting smushed forward. But when those molars come up, what do we have to do? We have like a little mini surgery to get them out because they mess up your bite. We don't need them. We don't need those. Whales have a pelvic bone. What hangs off of a pelvis? Legs. Ever seen a whale with legs? No. If they had legs, it would like drag, and it would cause them to slow down in their swimming. They're more shaped like a missile, which allows them to smoothly, they call that hydrodynamic. Some snakes have hip bones too. So it shows that they were related to something that had legs. If you're a female whale, and you have the choice between the whale who's got big, long legs hanging from him, who swims slower, who could get his legs bitten by predators. Do you want your babies to have those legs? No. You're gonna be like, no, I like that guy without the legs. She's gonna choose. We call this sexual selection within natural selection, where females will look at all of the possible mates and choose the one with the best genetics to pass on to her offspring, given the current environment. So in different organisms, what's hot might depend on legs or no legs. Do you think humans choose the best sexual selections? would we really want to choose like really skinny people who, if food runs out, they're gonna die off quickly? Like, our society emphasizes thinness is so sexy, right? But evolutionarily, you want somebody who's maybe not like super overweight, but you want somebody who's got some padding to survive a famine. So here you can see like hip bones, right? A salamander or us, we have a purpose for our hip bones. We have back legs. No legs, but still have remnants of those hip bones, which means these are vestigial structures. Your molars are vestigial. Your appendix is vestigial. All right, we're gonna do like 5 more minutes, just to. Okay, some unrelated organisms share similar characteristics, but they don't have a close common ancestor. So a bird who's got bones in its forelimbs, or a bat, birds and bats have the same thing we have, right? How about a butterfly? Do they have bones in their wings? They're an invertebrate, they don't have bones. But they both have wings, right? Birds, butterflies, they both have wings, but they're not very closely related. I mean, all organisms are related in some way, go back. There's not a close ancestor. We call these analogous structures. Like an analogy, it's similar, but not quite. So we do not have a close common ancestor. They do not, the characteristics that they share do not show an evolutionary relationship. Right? Vertebrates is one group, invertebrates is another group. We have some vertebrates that fly and some invertebrates that fly, but we don't share a close common ancestor. We don't show that we evolved these traits from the same ancestor. They show convergent evolution. They're moving toward each other. They're converging because they show similar traits. But again, still not a close evolutionary relationship. Make sure you understand the difference between homologous, vestigial, and analogous. Okay, so the flying, right? We know, like I said, one's an invertebrate, no bones. Dragonfly wings are like 2 cells thick. 2 cells thick. Can you imagine a bird with a 2-cell thick? You couldn't fit bones in a 2-cell thick wing. So here you have an invertebrate who has a wing that's very, very, very different than that. All right, so forelimbs or arms of the seal and the penguin have a humerus and phalanges. Are these structures homologous, vestigial, or analogous? Which one? Right. So I say they share humerus and phalanges, right? So they have the same bones in their forelimbs. So they are homologous structures. They come from a common ancestor. We can look at embryos. You're going to look at embryos today. When embryos, so in embryos, like we get genes and then we end up eventually looking like the adult version. We know that genes affect our cells in very specific ways. But early on, groups that share a common ancestor, their embryos will look very similar. So as an embryo, you looked like a bird or a pig or an elephant. And then eventually the genetics kick in and change you to look like a human. Okay, can you tell the difference between the pig and the humans? Right, as adults? I hope so. This is all of them as embryos. It'd be, if I didn't label these, would it be kind of hard to pick which one is which? Yeah. So we look similar because we share a related ancestor. Okay, we're gonna stop there. That perfectly lines up with the plan. Okay. Let's head over. Thank you for hanging in there.